Welcome all the presenters and special guests. I'd like to particularly welcome General Jeffery, probably best known in Eastern Australia as Governor-General for 5 years, from 2003 to 2008, but perhaps better known in Western Australia, his home state, as State Governor between 1993 and 2000. General Jeffery had a distinguished military career spanning 35 years, serving in Malaya, Borneo, Papua New Guinea and Vietnam, where he was awarded the Military Cross and the South Vietnam Cross for Gallantry. These are just a couple of the long list of military and civilian awards he has been awarded. But he is here today as the first advocate for soil health. I'll leave it to General Jeffery to tell us about his recent appointment, which is one of only many sponsoring and advocacy roles he performs. And I'd have to say that he did mention last night when I was talking to him that he tends to relinquish some of his other responsibilities and focus very much on soil. As I'm sure when you hear him speak, you'll realise he has a great passion for soil. And I think it's very important, and we're lucky to have someone of such stature appointed to take on a role such as this, to raise the importance soil plays in our agriculture and environment. General Jeffery was born in a small town in Western Australia with a population of 600 now. I gather perhaps in his day it was much smaller, and perhaps 30 or 40, somebody was telling me last night, called Wiluna on the edge of the Western Desert. Wiluna has an annual rainfall of 250 millimetres, so I can only guess the soil there is pretty arid. As Murray CMA board member with particular responsibility for soil and landscapes, I hold a strong view of the importance soil health plays. I believe if we get the soil right, many other environmental problems will fall into place. As a mixed farmer at Rand, 80 kilometres northwest of here, growing winter cereals, I need to increase my productivity to remain viable. We cereal growers were getting an annual recorded increase in productivity of 3% annually. Half of this was from better varieties and half from better farming systems. That seems to have plateaued in recent years. And it is a concern to us and our survival that we must get that productivity increases going again. And my feeling is the next major increase in productivity will come from below the soil surface. I think we've plateaued particularly on what we can do in plant varieties above the surface. Certainly there's probably some opportunities to increase our productivity there, but I just think there's so much unknown of what's happening below the surface, and I think there's huge potential to capitalise on what is there and get better knowledge. The theme of the forum, doing more with less, is a huge challenge, because every time I look at my budget, it seems to be the reverse. I seem to be spending more trying to achieve the same result and live only in hope that I actually increase my productivity. Unfortunately, I have to return to our board meeting, excuse me, so I'll have to learn second-hand how to achieve more with less, but I wish you luck. I'd once again like to thank General Jeffery for making his time available to come here today and for help raising the profile of this issue and taking on the role of soils advocate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed for that very warm welcome given on behalf of you all, and to distinguished guests, all ladies and gentlemen. It really is a tremendous pleasure to be with you this morning. I've got to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I understand about 10 minutes for questions, which I'll answer if they're not too hard. But I've always had the highest regard for farmers and indeed all aspects of agricultural enterprise, having spent much of my childhood on farm in Western Australia on a dairy farm down in the southwest, a little place called Mannup. And indeed, I nearly became a farmer, except I joined the school cadets and was ambushed by the army. I never regretted that, but I've always retained a great love of farmers, farming and our outback landscapes. Could I thank you for the invitation to share with you something about this Soils for Life program and my role as National Advocate for Soil Health. The responsibilities of the NECMA are numerous and of course extend across floodplain management, river health and facilitating and delivering education and grant programs. And very importantly, I believe, NECMA was selected as one of the first 19 Soils for Life case studies contained within this book, Innovations for Regenerative Landscape Management. So well done to you all, and your involvement I hope will lead to many other catchments joining the clan. Now, you might well ask why a retired soldier and a former Governor-General established the Soils for Life program. And funnily, it's because I believe that globally and here in Australia, we face a very serious problem. The global demand for food will almost double by 2050, and how we meet this demand is going to be the interesting question, because globally we're losing agricultural land at about the rate of 1% per year, where soils are likely to be increasingly degraded, where there'll be substantially less available water, particularly in China, India, Africa and the Middle East, where a lot of their water for agriculture is coming from irreplaceable aquifers that were established over geological time, tens or hundreds of thousands of years, and are being farmed at such a rate that it will be unsustainable. And of course we've got the increasing of farming input costs, and in many countries where R&D funds are likely to be inadequate. We have, particularly over the past 100 years, mined and degraded soils and natural resources from our land surfaces and oceans, and cleared around 75% of the Earth's primary forests and their carbon drawdown capability. We've depleted over 8 billion hectares of our former deep organic soils. We've created over 4 billion hectares of man-made deserts, and currently the globe is consuming about 125 to 150% of the sustainable resources of the planet. Now, this is pretty serious stuff. And at the World Forest Summit, Stockholm, in March 2013, the key speaker stated that we're losing 20 billion tonnes of fertile soil every year, either through wind erosion or water erosion, which is the equivalent of 3 tonnes per capita. In Syria, for example, overgrazing and deforestation have compounded the land desertification process, and drought and water scarcity have exacerbated this process, and this in turn led to massive crop failures from 2006 to 2011. If you look at the whole history of the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, which used to be lush and green and forests and agriculture and so on, now desert. If you look at the decreasing capacities of the Nile Delta and so on, you understand very clearly where I'm coming from. Now, in Australia, where, notwithstanding the excellent work of innovative farmers, catchment authorities and some pretty good science, we're facing the reality that we're already impacted by climate extremes and a series of interrelated challenges that include an increasingly aridifying landscape, particularly in the southern half of the continent, where 60% of our arable land is degraded in some way, some of it quite seriously. We've got more salinity and erosion. I think in WA, when I was governor there, salinity was occurring at a rate of about a football ground an hour, and I don't think it's improved much. We've got more erratic and unreliable rainfall, excessive evaporation, diminishing river flows and decreasing dam storage, longer droughts, and consequently not just more wildfires but hotter fires that are actually killing the microbes in the soil. I think we're having more severe storms, cyclones and flooding, and you've got spiralling input costs. The problems of population growth with increasing demand on resources, and of course the expansion of population from villages to town, generally taking up the best agricultural land because that's where expansion takes place. And our large cities as urban hotspots, which I think do influence local climate, including precipitation. We've got mining issues, and I think probably an overburden of uncoordinated regulation. So these things, ladies and gentlemen, are the realities with which you're all too familiar, so I don't need to elaborate. Well, that's on the negative side. But the positive side is that we've got the answers, as you are so clearly demonstrating in your catchment area, and as are the farmers who are part of this particular area in Albury-Wodonga. And today I want to focus on these realities, or the key reality, which really is about the Soils for Life program in the context of how we look after soil, water and vegetation. And in my view, that is the key. We do not look at soil as a single thing, or water as a single thing, or vegetation. We have to look at them as an integrated whole. And those farmers that are able to do that successfully as we've demonstrated in this Soils for Life program report, have been successful in reducing their input costs, becoming economically viable but sustainable in the context of healthy soils, healthy animals, healthy food and healthier people. Our case study farmers' common approach to landscape regeneration has been to successfully integrate the measurement or the management of soil, water and vegetative cover. And in so doing, they've been able to restore resilience in the landscape, not only to regenerate their land, but to make it more able to cope with climate change impacts and thus maintain their productivity and their profitability. I've been up in a place called Wild Catcham in Western Australia, semi-arid sheep and wheat. A couple there called the Haggertys. They've had 6 years of drought, 150 mil of rain, yet they still get a good wheat crop every year, and they still get summer lambing, and they are still rehabilitating salty salt plains. And they're doing it because they've got their soil, water and vegetative integration pretty right. Now, as stated in the Comprehensive Australia State of the Environment Report 2011, which I think is a terrific document, the 3 key indicators of soil condition are carbon dynamics, acidification and soil erosion. A 4th indicator is dryland salinity. This is a direct result of vegetation clearing or excessive vegetation clearing, which has dramatically affected the hydrological cycle across the continent. And recovery from land salinisation may not be possible at all in places where soil structure has been lost. I want to talk a bit about carbon. The carbon content of soil, we believe, is a key indicator of its health. Carbon is the one measurable driver that underpins the natural system from which all life is derived. It's the carbon content of soils that governs their capacity to retain and supply more water within the soil and to sustain active plant growth to enable the drawdown of CO2 via photosynthesis and its biosequestration into soil carbon sinks. Across the Australian dryland cropping and grazing sector, it would be unusual to find actively farmed soils with a carbon content of 1.5% or more. Normal soil carbon levels for quality agriculture, I'm told, should be around about 4 or 5%. The assessment summary of the state and trends of soil carbon in the State of the Environment Report 2011 shows that of the 39 regions assessed across the continent, only 4 have shown improvement in either grade or trend. Conversion from native vegetation to agriculture has typically reduced soil carbon by 20 to 70%. We urgently need, therefore, to increase ground cover and return high organic matter in soils. I believe we need to strive for 100% of mixed and preferably green ground cover for as close to 100% of the time as we can manage. Soil carbon sequestration is also assisted through systems that use minimal tillage, planned rotational grazing and the newer biofertilisers. And these holistic principles enhance microbial and fungal ecologies that optimise humate formation from the biomass produced rather than through oxidation. Increased soil carbon levels have the means to reduce our reliance on costly fossil fuels, as the level of soil carbon directly impacts soil fertility. Soil carbon also promotes plant and animal resistance to disease and insect infestation, and it provides the means to draw down very large quantities of CO2 from emissions. We know of some innovative farmers sequestering up to 10 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum through biofarming techniques. We have a comprehensive map of soil types across Australia, but what we need now is a broad acre, quick and accurate to business standards measuring system. Soil acidification affects about half of Australia's agriculturally productive soils, and this in part is attributable to current agricultural practices of excessive use of fertilisers. Acidification restricts options for land management and for growing acid-sensitive crops, and it looms as a major constraint in Australia's capacity to increase carbon in agricultural soils. Increasing the application of lime is, therefore, needed to avoid irreparable damage. Now, current rates of soil erosion by water across much of Australia now exceed soil formation. But by far, the strongest determinant of erosion is wind. Land management practices can either moderate or accelerate both water and wind erosion, and the key to controlling soil erosion is the maintenance of preferably green protective soil cover, plants of all sorts, whether it's crops, grasses, oranges, rose bushes or whatever. This in turn facilitates greater retention of water in the soil and improves photosynthetic activity. Let me talk briefly about water. The restoration of functional vegetative cover has the capacity to facilitate a cooler land mass by re-establishing what you all know as the small water cycle, thus bringing about a more even and regular distribution of precipitation. Increased soil organic matter improves penetration and retention of rainfall, noting that for every gram of carbon that you get back into the soil, it can hold up to 8 grams of water. Healthy soil then acts as a sponge and a filter system where water seepage is slower and available for plants and animals over a much longer period. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we should regard water, and indeed soil and vegetation, as 3 primary national natural strategic assets. And in respect to water, we're securing an adequate supply of safe, reliable water will become a strategic determinant for communities, regions and nations worldwide. It's assessed now that over a quarter of Australia's river systems are close to unsustainable extraction. Over 80% of our wetlands, which are the kidneys of any river system, have been drained, and about 1 million kilometres of our river systems have been incised such that in flowing below their floodplains, they are disconnected from them. We have altered the essential natural hydrological water cycles of much of the land through intervention to deliver water to storage and irrigation systems. I'm not making a criticism of this because it was all done at the time for very good reasons, but I think we have to realise that where we have made mistakes that we can prove, then we've got to do something about fixing them. So how do we redress this situation and maximise the capture and retention of the rainfall that falls on our landscape? Well, if you look at this table here as a map of Australia and 100 drops of rainfall on it in a given year, 10% end up in the rivers, 2% up in the dams, 2% run off the roads and the roofs. That's 14%, and that's what we focus all our attention on. We ignore the other 86% falling on the landscape, of which a staggering 50% goes up there in unnecessary evaporation because it cannot filtrate the soil. So that is 25 times the quantity of water in all our dams and 2.5 times the quantity in all our rivers evaporates because we can't get it and hold it in the soil where it should do its job. We can't afford such profligate waste. We urgently need to understand the processes that govern the natural hydrology of our landscape, our total landscape, the whole of the country, and we need to adopt a front-of-pipe philosophy that focuses on capturing and storing water in soil, and thus better using rainfall where it falls. Many of the innovative farmers documented in our Soils for Life report describe measures they have taken to return to natural hydrological processes, and by restoring riparian zones, recharging wetlands, they made water available for uptake by plants and animals over longer periods. Many of you may have heard of Peter Andrews, seen him on Australian Story. I think he's one guy in Australia that really understands hydrology, and I'm not sure how much hydrology is taught in our universities or agricultural colleges. I don't see a lot of it really discussed in an informed way in many of the field days that I attend. It's interesting to note that if we were to restore the key environment assets of the Murray-Darling Basin, namely the upland wetlands, some estimates suggest that we could retain 20,000 gigalitres more water in the landscape every year. That's 4 or 5 times the quantity of water that's being parcelled out through permits. Let's say a few words on vegetation. Like the soil that supports it, vegetation is fundamental to ecosystem processes and human survival. It's vital for producing oxygen for animal and human life, for biodiversity, for climate regulation, for hydrological and ecosystem processes. for maintaining soil integrity and stability and producing food, fibre, medicines and shelter. World deforestation is estimated at 13.7 million hectares a year. Australia has about 770 million hectares of land, of which 550 million are under agricultural or grazing. And although former policies of active land clearing are no longer in practice, around 1 million hectares of native vegetation was cleared in the decade of 2010. Land health is further at risk from changed water and fire regimes and overgrazing in some parts, and as remnant vegetation continues to deteriorate, topsoil is increasingly lost. Poor soils are unable to support regeneration of healthy vegetation and nutrient cycles break down. And of course, nutrients, as you know better than me, are necessary for healthy soil and vegetation function, and they're also fundamental to healthy plants and thus healthy food, healthy animals and healthier people. Mineral depletions in fruit and vegetables have been identified, and today the food we eat, whilst obviously safe, is probably generally less nutritious than it was before World War II. The type and quality of the food we eat directly affects our annual health budget, currently running at around 115, 120 billion a year. As much of this enormous expense is the result of ramifications of lifestyle diseases such as diabetes, which boil down to diet choices and exercise. Again, a number of case study farmers have reported that by increasing organic matter derived directly from increased vegetation in their soil, its health and thus its microbial and nutritional cycle have much improved. Also, the use of organic fertilisers and composts and planned rotational grazing has enhanced the proliferation of not only native grasses and other vegetation, but also crop production, and animal numbers have increased and the quality of both improved. Better quality food products can therefore be produced more sustainably. Some of our case studies describe large-scale reforestation in the form of shelter belts to mitigate salinity problems, to build organic material in soils, to enhance its health and fertility, and protect from further topsoil loss. Further, as again, I'm sure you know better than anyone, trees and heavy vegetation do moderate temperature, and vegetation protects the ground. If you take a paddock of grass and it's 30 degrees and there's a house in the paddock, it's probably 27 degrees in the house because the roof protects from direct sunlight. And if you've got a big tree in that paddock, it's probably 22 or 23 degrees. It's not because of the shade of the tree, it's because of the photosynthetic action of what the tree does and sunlight pulling down or direct heat being converted to cooling through the vaporisation of water being pulled up and then heading off and hopefully dropping as local rainfall 50 clicks down the road. I think too that deforested city landscapes have become hotspots and have interfered with this cooling system. They too urgently need to be revegetated. If you take a car park next to this paddock that I was talking about as representing a city, the car park could be probably 40 degrees, where the paddock's 30, the house is 27, under the tree it's 22 or 23. Now a little bit on our Soils for Life program. Basically, it's to enhance Australia's natural environment through the provision of information and education on innovative leading performance in managing the natural environment with a particular focus on the rural landscape. And we've identified leading practice in landscape regeneration and to date have documented and substantiated 19 case studies in our 2012 report. Our goal is the widespread adoption of leading practice so that ultimately regenerative landscape management practice becomes the norm. And we're hoping to roll out to 40 in the coming months, which will broadly replicate the Australian landscape and catchment, not totally. You can't do it with 40, but it won't be a bad shot. The purpose of these studies and the demonstration days that we're running on them is to encourage local communities and organisations such as NRMs and CMAs to have a look at them and say, right, there's something in that, and then to decide whether they want to make those changes themselves. Our last host function was at Tim Wright's place in Yarralla in North East New South Wales, and his property is just magnificent in terms of cattle and sheep, and the fact that he no longer has to use fertiliser or chemicals, that his water is terrific, that he runs an intensive cell grazing business where he's got 340 paddocks of about 4 or 5 hectares each, and he grazes his sheep and cattle for 3 or 4 days in each, and has really worked out the management of that very well. One of the greatest impediments to adopting regenerative landscape management is the perception of the resources required to make changes. So currently we're developing, with case study farmers and financial institutions, discovery workshops to provide a day-long step-through of how change might be undertaken on your enterprise and to understand the various options on how this could be resourced. Understanding the how-tos as it applies to your circumstances and the costs versus the benefits will give individuals greater confidence to make good decisions on their future. Interestingly, in many of our case study farmers, change has been resourced through reduction of traditional inputs such as money spent on fertilisers, herbicides, fuel, labour and the likes. So we've got to do that. We've got to roll out the 40 and then hopefully another 100, to which we're going to provide, if we can fund it adequately, an incentive type program. And this might be incentives for farmers in terms of good advice and consistent and longer term advice in what to do. It might be in terms of repairing a riparian zone or rehydrating a wetland, and that we'll see if that incentive program does in fact work. I think it will, and I'm hoping that from the current 1% of farmers who've implemented innovative change, that the incentivisation, if it's done properly, might swing another 10%, and that might be the leverage level needed to bring about change across the whole of our farming community. So that's all pretty good. Finally, could I talk to soil advocacy? I've been appointed the National Soil Advocate. I'm charged with raising awareness of the importance of soil. Appointed by the Prime Minister. I'm not working for the government. It's an independent role. I have to put a final report to the Prime Minister at the end of the year, and the role will involve the development of soil research priorities to complement existing efforts to develop a national soil research development and extension strategy. My role is also to help farmers to improve the health of their soil, as this underpins not only biodiversity but also sustainable agricultural productivity across Australia. Now, a couple of big things have happened in terms of soil science. First, the Chief Scientist has managed to get soil and water and food up as one of the 5 top national priorities for research. The next big thing, I think, is to really look at the type of questions that we want to ask our soil, water and vegetation scientists. And to me, this is where the big gap is. Are we asking the right questions, both nationally and down at your level? And how is the information that is needed, how is it gathered, how is it collected, how is it analysed, and then how is the relevant parts got to the user, whether it's the farmer, whether it's the catchment authority, whether it's the politician, or whether it's the CSIRO and so on. So I think that needs to be really refined, that information chain and channel, and the questions that need to be asked we're looking at in terms of the couple of groups that I've established recently to do precisely that. I'd like to see uniform methodology for the gathering, processing, storing and dissemination of information, and uniform terminology in describing soils and the measurement of their carbon content. I'd also like to see science doing a comprehensive stocktake of our water resource. How much do we need? How much are we getting? How is it distributed? And how do we reduce particularly evaporative wastage as a priority? I want to see, therefore, a national consolidated national framework for the regeneration of the Australian landscape. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by just perhaps talking about 5 or 6 key principles. The first key one, I think, is to recognise soil, water and vegetation as our 3 national natural primary strategic assets, to manage them accordingly, that as strategic assets, in an integrated way. The second might be to recognise and reward farmers fairly, not just for their product of food and fibre, but as primary carers of the agricultural landscape. And Indigenous people must be involved in this too, because so much of the landscape belongs to them. The third is to recognise that science has to be focused in such a way that it's going to ask the key questions that need to be asked. The fourth is to recognise that agriculture and environment is not just about 2 departments. It's also about education, it's about health, it's about regional development, it's about Indigenous, it's about mining, it's about trade, and it's about national security. To pull all these together needs somebody in Parliament, in state and federal level, with the horsepower to do it, whether it's a Deputy Prime Minister or Deputy President equivalent level, or a Minister that's given the authority to pull all these groups together to get an overarching national landscape regeneration plan. So that's what we have to do, and if we do it well, and if we can get governments to agree to some fundamental thoughts in this respect, then I think we'll be well on the way to doing good things for farmers, for agriculture and for the landscape in general. And I would hope that if Australia can lead the way in this particular, with this particular task, it will not only lead to sustainably productive increases in food production, perhaps from our present capacity to feed 60 million people to somewhere perhaps around 100, 120, but if we're able to export knowledge on how our soils and water and vegetation should be managed, it could be that we could help feed 1 billion people around the world when a lot of people are going to be hungry and thirsty. I think that's enough for me. I've taken a little bit longer than normal, but there's a couple of minutes for question. Lovely to talk to you, and thank you very much.